I've told this story exactly once before tonight, and that was to my dog Della, who was the only other witness and who has the good sense not to ask questions. I'm not going to ask you to believe it. I gave up on that possibility before I even decided to say it out loud. What I am asking is that you hear it, because I've been carrying it for going on 4 months now, and a man can only hold so much inside a chest that was already pretty full when this started. It was a Tuesday evening in mid-October. The light had gone the color of old brass, the way it does on that particular ridge in the southern Missouri, when the days get short and the hardwoods are past their color, and the hills go the grey-brown of dried mud. I was sitting in the chair on the porch with a cup of coffee I hadn't touched. There was a second cup on the railing beside me where I always put it. I was looking at the tree line without seeing it, the way a man does when his mind has gone somewhere his eyes can't follow. And then I was very still, because something was standing at the far end of the porch railing, and whatever it was not small, and it was not looking at me. It was looking at the railing. It was doing something deliberate with its hands. I need to go back to the week before to explain what that meant. I need to go back further than that, really. I need to go back 18 months. Ruth died in late November, a year and a half before any of this happened. It was a short illness, the kind that does not give you time to argue with it. 6 weeks from the first doctor's visit to the end. She was 61 years old. We had been married 34 years, and for most of those years, she had a habit of tearing a piece of bread into small pieces every morning and laying them along the porch railing before she poured her own coffee. She said it was for the birds, and it was for the birds, but I think it was also just a thing she did because her hands needed something to do at that hour, and that was the something she had chosen. Sparrows, mostly. A pair of Carolina wrens that came back every year. She knew their calls the way I knew road conditions. After she was gone, I kept doing it. I don't know that I made a decision about it. The first morning I did it, I was standing in the kitchen and I tore a heel off the bread loaf before I even understood what I was doing. My hands knew the motion. So I went out and laid the pieces on the railing and stood there feeling like a fool, and also like the only person left in the world who understood what that railing was for. I kept doing it every morning after that, for 18 months. I want to be clear about the kind of man I am because I think it matters for what comes later. I spent 31 years carrying mail on a rural route through Howell County. 112 miles of road, give or take, every working day. You get to know country that way. You get to know what a field looks like when the soil is wrong, what a creek sounds like the morning before it floods, which dogs are noise and which dogs mean it. You learn to read things. You learn that the world gives you information continuously, and your job is to pay attention to it and not add anything that isn't there. There was a stretch of the route that came down off Buford Ridge through a long bottom along Spring Creek, where I had known every mailbox owner by their first name and the names of their children, and the kind of work they did and which of them were home during the day. The Easleys had 4 kids and a dairy operation that went under in 1996, and I had carried the certified letters from the bank that I had hated to deliver. The Whitakers had a son in the Marines who wrote home about once a month from a base in Germany, and I had handed those letters to his mother across her porch railing for 3 years, running and watched her face soften every time. There was a couple named the Stovers down at the bottom of the hollow who'd been in their 70s the first year I'd had the route, and who I had checked on in the wintertime by tapping the horn at their drive when I dropped their mail. 2 short taps, and waiting to see Mr. Stover's hand at the kitchen window before I drove on. The morning Mr. Stover did not come to the window, I had pulled up the lane and gone to the door, and I had been the one who'd found him in the chair by the wood stove, and I had been the one to call the county. That was 1988. I had carried mail to Mrs. Stover for another 9 years after that, until she went into a home in Ozark, and I had visited her there twice. I tell you this because I want you to understand that the route was not a job in the sense that most jobs are jobs. It was 31 years of paying close attention to one piece of country and the people on it, and it had taught me a way of looking at things that I have not been able to put down. There were mornings on that route when I would notice that a particular field had been bush-hogged in a different pattern than usual, and I would know, without being told, that the man who farmed it had hired help that week, which usually meant his back had gone out again. There were afternoons when I would see a curl of smoke from a chimney that ought to have been cold by 10 in the morning, and I would slow the truck and watch for movement at the windows. The country tells you what it has been doing and what is about to happen, if you keep your eyes on it long enough to learn its grammar. The flip side of that, which I have only fully understood in the last few months, is that a country which has been paying attention to you for 31 years has had time to learn yours. I had not thought of it that way until the events I am about to describe forced me to. I had thought of attention as a one-way operation. I had been wrong about that, and I had been wrong about it for most of my adult life, and the correction came at me from a direction I had not been guarding. A man who has been a witness for 31 years sometimes forgets that he has also been a thing watched, and that the watching may have gone on across a fence line he never noticed. I retired 3 years ago. 31 years is enough. I came back to the 11 acres I'd owned since Ruth and I were young, the place on the ridge above the hollow with the creek at the property line and the mixed timber running south. Ruth had wanted a garden there, and we'd had one. And after she died, I kept the beds turned, but I didn't plant much. I kept the place up. I split the wood and maintained the fences and kept the gutters clear, because that is what you do with a piece of land. You don't let it go just because the season went hard. Della was Ruth's dog, technically. A blue tick hound, going on 12 years old by the time this story takes place, with a bad left hip and a deep voice she hadn't fully used in 2 years. She moved slowly, and she slept a lot, and she had opinions about the weather that were almost always right. She slept at the foot of the bed, and she ate twice a day, and she followed me from room to room with the quiet persistence of something that knows it is the last of its kind in a particular place. Marcus, my son, had not called in 2 years. That is a longer story than this one. The short version is that grief makes people ugly sometimes, and we had been ugly to each other in the months after Ruth died, and eventually the silence had hardened the way silence does when nobody moves toward it. I thought about calling him. I thought about it the way you think about a loose board on the porch you haven't fixed yet, something you step around so many times, you stop seeing it as a problem and start seeing it as just a feature of the floor. If you've ever been in a season like that one, you know what I mean when I say I wasn't miserable. Miserable is acute. What I was had become structural. I woke up. I made 2 cups of coffee by habit. I put the second cup on the railing where Ruth had always sat hers while she did the bread, and I drank mine and watched the birds come and go. I drove into town on Tuesdays. I split wood on Saturday mornings. I called my sister Arlene every other Sunday. Conversations that lasted about 11 minutes and covered nothing of substance. I was enduring the calendar, 1 page at a time. If you've ever kept a ritual past the point where anyone else would call it reasonable, just because stopping felt like a second loss, I don't have to explain this part to you. If you haven't, I'm not sure I can. The first strange thing happened in the 3rd week of September, about 3 weeks before the evening I described at the opening. I came out to the porch in the morning, and the bread pieces were gone. Not scattered, not half-eaten the way the birds left them when they worked through quickly. Gone, every piece as cleanly as if someone had swept the railing with a hand. The birds were out there in the yard waiting. the way they did when they arrived before I'd put the bread out, hopping in the leaves at the base of the oak. They hadn't taken it. They hadn't even been up on the railing yet. I looked at the railing for a while. I looked at the yard. I told myself a raccoon had come up in the night and cleaned it off, which was a reasonable explanation, and I put the bread out fresh and went inside and thought about it for about 2 minutes more than I should have for something that was obviously a raccoon. The same thing happened the next morning, and the morning after that. On the fourth morning, I set the bread out and then went inside and watched through the kitchen window until the birds came. The birds worked through the bread the way they always did, and by the time I poured my second cup, everything was normal. The bread was gone in the usual way, picked clean in pieces, a few crumbs left at the joints where the railing posts met the boards. The fifth morning, I set the bread out and did not watch. I came back an hour later, and it was gone again, clean. The birds were in the yard, but they had not been up on the railing. Their tracks in the dew on the porch boards would have told me if they had, and the dew was undisturbed. I stood there, and I went through the list. Raccoon. Possible, but a raccoon moving that cleanly without disturbing the dew, in the dark, without leaving any trace on the railing boards, was a stretch. Possum. Same problem. Fox. Foxes don't climb porch railings, and even if one had, a fox cleaning a flat surface would leave claw marks and fur and smell. I crouched down and looked at the railing boards in the early light. Nothing. No scratch, no scent I could place, no grease from fur. I told myself I was probably missing something obvious and went inside. Della started sleeping with her nose pointed at the tree line around that same time. Not aggressively, not with her hackles up, or any sound in her throat. She would settle herself on the porch in the evening, facing south toward where the timber started, and just stay that way. She had been a working scent hound once, though not for a long time. When she was younger, she had treed things with real conviction, a deep baying that carried half a mile. Now she just lay with her nose down and her eyes open and her breathing slow, and I couldn't tell if she was tracking something or sleeping with her eyes pointed in a direction. I watched her for a few evenings. She was not afraid. That was what caught my attention more than anything, because Della was old enough to have a well-earned suspicion of the world, and when something moved in the timber at night, she would lift her head and show her age in the tightness around her eyes. She wasn't doing that. She was calm in the way she got when she was comfortable with her surroundings, the way she was on Sunday mornings when nothing was expected of anyone. I went down to the creek on a Wednesday afternoon in late September, about 10 days after the bread started disappearing. We'd had 2 days of rain, and the alluvial bank on the near side of the creek was soft as potter's clay. I was checking the low spot in the fence where a section of wire had been working loose, and I saw the impression about 6 feet from the water. It was deep, deeper than a deer print in the same soil would have been, which told me what made it was heavy. It was long. I measured it against my boot, which is a size 11, and the impression was half again as long as my foot, and maybe half again as wide. There was no claw mark, which ruled out bear. The shape of it was not a hoof, which ruled out everything with hooves. There was a second impression about 4 feet away, and a third about 4 feet beyond that. And then the ground firmed up where it rose toward the hill, and I lost the trail. I stood there for a long time. I am not a person who believes in things I can't explain. I want to be plain about that. I've never been to one of those weekend conventions where people sell photographs, and I have never believed half of what I've seen on television. I had lived on this ridge for the better part of 30 years, and I had a good idea of what was in the timber around me. None of the ideas I had fitted what was in the mud in front of me. I looked at it for a while. I measured it 3 times with my boot because I wanted to be sure I was seeing what I was seeing. I walked the bank for 50 yards in both directions and found nothing else. I came back up to the house and I sat in the porch chair, and I turned the whole thing over in my mind the way I had learned to approach a problem on the route, methodically, eliminating what it couldn't be until what was left had to be what was right. What was left did not have a name I was comfortable using. That was the evening Della sat beside me for 3 hours straight, with her nose pointed at the timber and her breathing as slow as if she were sleeping. She made no sound. She did not raise her hackles. She just sat and paid attention to something I couldn't hear. I went inside before full dark. I did not feel threatened. I want to say that clearly because I know how this sounds. I felt watched, but there is a version of being watched that is not the same as being in danger, and a man who spent 30 years reading Land and Animals learns to know the difference. I started going to bed earlier that week. I told myself it was the season, the way the dark came on faster, and the mornings took longer to warm. But I was aware, going to sleep, that I was listening. I would lie there with Della warm at the foot of the mattress, and I would hear the timber sounds, the wind in the last dry leaves, the creak below, the occasional knock of a branch, and I would hear the absence underneath all of it, the way sound has a texture when something large and quiet is displacing it. 3 nights in a row, I heard nothing wrong. On the 4th night, I heard the bread on the railing go. A single soft sound, barely there, gone before I could identify it as anything specific. I did not get up. I lay in the dark, and I thought about Ruth putting the bread out every morning for 15 years, the careful way she tore the pieces, her hands working at the kitchen counter before the sun was up. She was not a person who made grand gestures. She was a person who did small things consistently because she believed the world ran on small things done consistently over time. She had been right about most things. The partial glimpse came on a Thursday evening in early October, about 2 weeks before the full encounter. I was coming around the corner of the house from the woodpile, an armload of split hickory against my chest, and I caught something at the edge of the tree line in my peripheral vision. Dark, very large. The quality of dark you get when something is absorbing light rather than being in shadow, a presence rather than a shape. I stopped. I set the wood down on the ground and I looked directly at the place where I had seen it. Nothing was there. The birds in the yard had gone quiet. The single crow that had been working the oak since morning was gone from its branch. Even the wind had stopped, which on that ridge at that time of year almost never happened. I stood in the yard for a long time. I kept my eyes moving the way you do when you're looking for movement in poor light, not fixing on any point, letting the peripheral vision do the work. Nothing moved. After a while, the birds came back, and then the crow, and then the wind picked up again from the north, and the moment was over. I went inside and put the wood by the stove and stood in the kitchen for a few minutes without doing anything in particular. I had no explanation for what I had not quite seen. It was not a deer, which I knew because of the height of it. The darkness had been above the level where a deer's body would be. It was not a bear, though this was bear country, because bears at the tree line at dusk have a way of moving, a loose roll in the shoulders, and the thing I had glimpsed had been still. I fixed myself a plate I didn't eat, and I sat at the kitchen table until it got late. The next 2 weeks were ordinary in almost every way. The bread disappeared each morning. Della sat at the porch in the evenings facing south. I went about the maintenance of the place, the wood splitting, the fence mending, the drive into town on Tuesdays, where I stopped at the hardware store and talked to Roy Gaines about nothing for 15 minutes, the way I had done every Tuesday for 3 years since Roy's wife had passed, and we had both fallen into the habit of needing a conversation that cost nothing. I did not tell Roy about any of it. I thought about it. I thought about the way he would nod, the careful, polite nod of a man whose friend was becoming strange, and I decided I was not ready for that nod. I told myself the whole thing was probably nothing. I told myself the bread was raccoons, and the impression in the mud had been a trick of wet ground, and I had caught a dark shape at the tree line because I was tired, and my eyes were 63 years old, and had been staring at hills for a long time. I almost believed it. The Tuesday evening before it happened, I was sitting on the porch in the dark after I came back from town, and Della was next to me with her chin on my knee, which she only did when she thought I needed it. I had the second coffee cup on the railing, the way I always did. I had not stopped putting it there. I did not examine why I hadn't stopped. It was the cup Ruth would have had, and I put it there, and that was as far as I let myself think about it. I looked at the tree line. I said out loud, to nobody, "I don't know what you want." Della's tail swept once across the porch boards. I don't know why I said it. I hadn't planned to say it. It just came out the way things come out when a man has been too quiet for too long, when the pressure behind a thing finally finds a small opening. I felt foolish for about 10 seconds, and then I felt something else, something I cannot name exactly. A loosening, like a knot that had been in my chest for a very long time had shifted just slightly, not released, but shifted. I went inside. I did not sleep well, but I did sleep. The encounter happened on a Tuesday evening, 5 days after that. It was the 14th of October. The light had come up brass in the late afternoon, the way I described at the start, and the air was cold enough that I could see my breath when I sat down in the porch chair with my coffee. Della settled beside me on the boards rather than the step, which she did when the temperature was dropping, and the boards held the warmth from the afternoon sun longer. I had the second cup on the railing. The bread was already out. I had put it there at 7 that morning the way I always did, and it had disappeared the way it always did. I was not watching the tree line. I was looking into the cup I was holding, the way you do when the day has been quiet and your mind has run out of things to push around. I was thinking about nothing in particular, or I was thinking about the hollow way December was going to feel, which is close enough to nothing that there's no real difference. Della's tail swept once on the porch boards. Not an alarm, not a question. A slow, single sweep, the kind she made when something familiar arrived in her vicinity. I looked up. At the far end of the porch, perhaps 20 feet from where I sat, something was standing at the railing. It was large in a way that was not about size alone, but about presence, the way certain things fill the space around them past their own edges. Dark, as I had seen it before at the tree line. 8 feet, I would estimate, perhaps a little more. The shoulders were wide, the way a working man's shoulders are wide after decades of real work, but at a scale that removed the comparison from anything I had reference for. It was not looking at me. This is the part that I keep coming back to when I try to understand what happened. It was not looking at me. It was facing the railing, and it was doing something with its hands, moving with a deliberateness that I recognized without being able to name. The slow, purposeful motion of something completing a task it had thought about. Della had not moved. Her chin was still on the boards and her breathing was slow, and she was watching the far end of the porch with the calm attention of something that has already made up its mind that there is no cause for alarm. I did not move. I do not know if I could have. Not from fear, and I want to be precise about that distinction, because it matters to me that this is precise. I could not move because I was inside a moment that had a specific weight, and moving would have broken something that I understood, even then, without words, was fragile. The hands on the railing continued their work. After what I believe was about a minute, though it felt both shorter and longer than that, the creature turned its head slightly in my direction. Not fully, just enough. The light was behind it, the last of the brass dusk, and the face was in shadow, but the eye that caught the light was dark and very still, and whatever was in it was not aggression, and was not fear, and was not the blankness of an animal that has not registered a human presence. It had registered my presence, that much I knew. It had known I was there before I had known it was there, and it had come to the railing anyway. I held the coffee cup in both hands, and I did not speak, and I did not move, and the world had gone completely quiet. The birds gone, the creek below swallowed by the stillness, Della's breathing the only sound. After another few minutes, the hands drew back from the railing. The creature straightened, a slow, unhurried rise to its full height. It looked in my direction once more, fully, for just a moment, and I looked back. Then it turned and walked to the edge of the porch and stepped down into the yard and moved toward the tree line with the same deliberate quiet I had been hearing in my sleep for 2 weeks, without knowing what it was. By the time it reached the first trees, it was already part of the dark. A few more steps and it was gone, and the timber closed behind it as if it had never opened. Della's tail swept once more across the boards. I sat there for a while. The cold was sharper now that the sun was fully down, and my coffee was cold in the cup, and the porch was exactly as it had always been, except for what was on the railing at the far end. I did not go look right away. I sat there for what I think was another 10 or 15 minutes, just breathing, and then I got up, and I walked down to the far end of the railing, and I looked at what the creature had left. There was a small arrangement of dried berries, dark and carefully placed, the kind of wild things that grow on the edge of the hollow. Hackberries and dried sumac, I thought, arranged in a loose cluster on the railing boards. And in the centre of the arrangement, a single river stone, smooth, pale, about the size of a man's palm. It was placed exactly where Ruth's bread had always gone. I stood there looking at it for a long time. The cold was real, and the night was real, and the stone was real under my fingers when I finally put my hand out and touched it, and there was no explanation in any category I had ever been given for what had just happened. And I found that I was crying, not loudly, not the way a man cries when he is asking for something, but the way a man cries when something he has been carrying alone for 18 months is suddenly, briefly, not alone anymore, when something he had not known could be witnessed has been witnessed. I picked up the second coffee cup, Ruth's cup. I held it for a moment, and then I set it back down beside the stone, and I stood there in the cold until I was done. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table. Della came in and lay down against my feet, and I put my hand on her, and she let me. I do not have a word for what I felt. I have been looking for one since October. The next morning, I woke up before light. I made 2 cups of coffee the way I always did. I put the second cup on the railing beside the stone, which I had left where it was, and I stood on the porch and looked at the timber, and then I went inside and I dialed Marcus's number. It rang 4 times and he picked up. I said, "It's your dad." There was a pause. He said, "I know." I said, "I wanted to call." Another pause. He said, "Okay." I said, I don't have a speech. I just wanted to hear your voice." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah." We talked for about 7 minutes, which was not enough and was more than nothing. I did not tell him about the night before. I told him the wood was in and the place looked decent and I was doing all right. He told me he was working in Columbus now, that he had a woman he was seeing, that things were pretty good. There was a lot we did not say. There is still a lot we have not said. But 7 minutes is a door that swings on a hinge, and a door on a hinge can open wider. He called again 3 weeks later. We talked for 22 minutes that time. We have a call scheduled for the Sunday after Thanksgiving, which is the first holiday plan I have made since Ruth died. I told Roy Gaines about the stone, eventually. Not the full story. Just that I had found a stone on the porch railing that somebody had left me, and that it had hit me harder than I expected. Roy looked at it the way Roy looks at most things, steady and unhurried, and he said, "Sometimes you don't know what you need until it shows up." I said, "I guess that's right." He said, "Ruth would have put it in the garden." I said, "She would have." I have not told the full story to anyone else in town, and I have no plans to. This is the first time I have said all of it out loud in one piece. And I will tell you honestly that I did not know until just now how much lighter that feels. A man can carry something for months in the dark and not understand how much room it was taking up until he sets it down somewhere and straightens up. The bread still disappears some mornings. Not every morning. About 3 times a week as far as I can tell. Always overnight. Always clean. I put it out anyway. I have not stopped putting it out. Della is slower than she was in October, and she sleeps more hours than she did then, and her hip bothers her enough on cold mornings that she takes the step off the porch sideways, and slow. But she still makes her way to her spot on the boards at evening, and faces the timber, and breathes slow and easy. She has not made a sound in the direction of the hollow since the night of the 14th. Whatever she is listening for, she seems to have decided it is not a problem. I have been out to the creek bank twice since then. Both times the soil was soft enough to hold impressions, and both times I found nothing. I did not look very hard. I was not really looking for evidence. I think I was looking at the timber, the way you look, at a place that holds something you are glad is there. There is one other thing I want to say before I finish. The night before she died, Ruth asked me if I thought the world was mostly good or mostly not. She was not afraid, she was just asking, the way she asked questions when she wanted to know my honest answer and not my comfortable one. I told her I thought it was about half and half, which was what I believed at the time and what I had been building toward believing for a long time before that. She thought about it for a moment, and she said, "I think there's more out there paying attention than we know." I said, "Maybe." She said, "The birds always come back." I said, "They do." That was more or less the last real conversation we had. I have thought about it a great deal since then, the way she said it. Quiet and certain, not as a comfort and not as a philosophy, but as a plain observation from a woman who had spent 30 years paying attention to a porch railing. I do not know what came to my porch on October 14th. I have descriptions, but I do not have a category, and I have stopped looking for one. I know what it did, and I know where it placed the stone, and I know that the placement was not an accident. And that is enough. That has to be enough. And it turns out it is more than enough, because the stone is still on the railing, and the stone is not going anywhere. It is the middle of January now. We have had 2 light snows, the kind that don't stick on the south-facing ground, but do gather in the low places, and the ridge looks the way it looks every January, pale and clean and very quiet. The porch is cold enough in the mornings that I don't sit long, just long enough to put the bread out and drink my coffee and let Della do her business in the yard. This morning, Della climbed back up the step and settled on the boards the way she does, slow and deliberate, left hip tucked. She pointed herself toward the timber, and then she put her chin down on her front paws and her eyes went soft. I sat in my chair with my coffee and I watched the birds work along the railing, the sparrows and the pair of Carolina wrens, back the way they are every year. There was frost still on the far side of the railing posts, the side that doesn't get sun until mid-morning, and it was white against the old wood. And the stone was there where it has been since October, smooth and pale on the railing where Ruth used to put the bread. The birds always come back.